speaker is Dr. Peter Chang. He is a practicing radiologist and has a joint appointment at UCI as an associate clinical professor in the School of Medicine and as an associate professor of computer science in the Donald Brennan School of Information and Computing Sciences. He is the director of the UCI Institute for Precision Health's Applied Artificial Intelligence Research Program, which translates machine learning methods into deployable solutions addressing clinical problems and matching the cost of care to its value. He is also co-director of the UCI Center for Artificial Intelligence in Diagnostic Medicine, a cross-disciplinary initiative with the mission to empower healthcare providers, researchers, and patients through the deployment of artificial intelligence healthcare applications. If that wasn't enough, he's also the co-founder of multiple AI startups, including most recently Avicenna.ai, a company focused on deep learning for medical imaging diagnosis. And he collaborates closely with industry partners from NVIDIA, Amazon, Canon, Medical, Palantir, and Bayer. And he leverages his unique cross-disciplinary clinical, academic, and industry perspective to provide insights at the intersection of healthcare and AI technology. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Chang.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dan, for that intro. A little bit longer than I would have expected, but it's a pleasure to be here. As you just heard, so I have a somewhat multifaceted background, both as a clinician and a software developer. And I also work a bit in the startup entrepreneurial space to translate a lot of this technology into the actual clinical workflow. And so anyways, I want to try to take that perspective and distill it in a way that gives you a sense of where AI is currently in healthcare. My goal is to really give you, again, a high-level overview of what's working and why certain things tend to be a better fit than others. I was also told that this was going to be up to an hour-long talk, which is quite a long time, I think, to be sitting in a room at 7 o'clock at night on a Wednesday. So what I'm probably going to do instead is try to keep it a little bit shorter and just give an opportunity at the end for you guys to ask questions and engage a little bit more. I think, again, this kind of topic, it's so broad. There's so many things I could talk about, and there's a good chance that whatever you're interested in is not going to be here. So I'm going to try to save, again, extra time for what I think will probably be a little bit more of an engaging and useful session at the end. All right. So with that in mind, before I start, I'm going to actually take one more quick poll because I've never been to this meeting before, and I'm actually not 100% sure where everyone is coming from here. So show of hands, how many of you guys are coming from a little bit more of a technical background, whether that's engineering, software development, right? So that's almost everybody, okay. And then what about how many of you have worked in some way with healthcare, whether that's on healthcare-related problems or maybe even a background in healthcare yourself? Okay, so actually a good chunk of the audience as well, probably over half of you guys. That's probably why you're here. So, okay, with that in mind, I will try to, tailor this discussion, acknowledging that you have an adequate background. If at any point something seems off or you're not sure what I just said or want me to slow down, please raise your hand and let me know. Happy to again, take it wherever you guys want. All right, so as a quick single slide primer, I think everyone here probably knows what I mean when I'm referencing artificial intelligence, or more specifically deep learning. But just to level set the group, what of course I'm talking about is a very specific flavor or style of machine learning where no explicit representation of the knowledge you want to model needs to be created or handcrafted by an expert. In other words, to analyze this single image of a CAT scan of the head, traditionally, I would need to go through and figure out, if a hemorrhage or blood in the brain looks a certain way, and therefore I need to look for certain patterns in certain parts of the body, right? That technique, it turns out, is not very scalable. Again, it kind of goes without saying, but prior to about 10 or 15 years ago, we had no automated commercial systems to do something even as simple as find a brain tumor or find a brain bleed, which again are relatively common and easy things to spot once you're trained. And so this shift from, again, a more handcrafted traditional machine learning approach to deep learning really has changed our field dramatically. Now, I will also continue to set a little bit more of a stage before I dive into specifics by highlighting a little bit of where we are on the global historical context of things. So if I had to place where we are on a continuum of certainly a lot of initial hype for a new technology to what some might say is a trough of disillusionment, right? To some steady state of adoption, I would say that currently healthcare is probably somewhere here. In other words, probably a little bit past the peak of hype, but certainly a lot of what you're hearing out there is not going to truly be delivered, right? So I think we're just past that and starting to come down to reality, but not quite there. And this is important to think about and consider because you'll hear so much about AI in the news and all the cool things that you would expect to be happening in hospitals today. And again, a lot of that is probably exaggerated. So why do I think that's true? Well, if you look here, while the projected market cap or projected, the projected market for AI in healthcare continues to grow year in, year out, very ambitious projections. The total amount of actual venture capital, for example, that is being spent and invested in this space has really started to plateau for the last few years. In fact, if you discount this very sharp spike for the advent, coinciding with the advent of large language model technology, such as GPT, where again, there was this temporary surge of interest, really a lot of the enthusiasm has, again, either leveled off or even dropped a little bit in the past year or two. A similar trend can be seen if you look at FDA approvals. Again, this initially might be startling. So in fact, it's true. In the past several years, we've seen hundreds of new AI algorithms approved nationally, which again, might be more than one would expect. But even that has sort of started to taper off and dip just ever so slightly in the past year. Now, if you look carefully, the FDA publishes a website that you can kind of look at and check out, what has been coming through and what is formally approved. If you look at that carefully and you try to categorize the types of problems people are focused on, I would say these are probably the top three. And I'm going to talk about each one of these three here in just a second, just to give you an overview and a sense and flavor of the types of things I'm talking about. Now, I will also point out, so my background is in imaging. I'm a radiologist by training. All the examples I'm going to be showing you here are going to be imaging related tonight. Again, part of that is a bias due to my own background, but about 90 to 95% of all FDA-approved tools are in our world of imaging. So this sort of gives you a reasonable flavor of what you might expect to see. All right, so when I say image processing, what do I mean there? Well, image processing is going to include a number of applications that deal with the actual imaging data before it gets to the radiologist or the expert interpreting the images. These are going to be things that either enhance the quality of the image or maybe go out and quantify and characterize the image a bit before interpretation. All right. Again, the first example I'm going to show you here is for disease quantification. So essentially going through raw imaging data and tracing out or quantifying something on the image, whether that's counting, whether that's measuring the surface area or volume of certain structures. This specific example is actually an image of the heart. So on cardiac MRI, it turns out that to determine the total volume of blood that's being pumped at different chambers, at different parts of the cardiac cycle, we would have traditionally needed to measure and trace out the contours of each structure individually on every single slice of an acquisition. If you have the luxury of students and trainees, this is typically what you would have such help do. But if not, this could take you hours. This is a good classic example of something that machine learning and specifically deep learning algorithms have really excelled at supporting. Here's another example looking at quantifying the volume of brain tumor. Amount of tumor volume on a brain MRI essentially here. For each of the following applications, I'm going to go through 3 major considerations or reasons why these applications have really come to the forefront. And those 3 are as follows. So the first is going to be technology. The technology here for segmentation and quantification is actually fairly mature. For those of you that work in AI and deep learning, you'll know that vision models for, again, either semantic segmentation, landmark detection, box localization, right? These are actually, again, reasonably solved. They're good, high-performing algorithms that we know should perform in a quite robust manner in a number of different scenarios. Second would be data. So data is a huge challenge in the world of medical imaging and healthcare broadly because typically, number one, we don't have a lot of it, right? And 2, because the data that we do have tends to be extremely heterogeneous. Fortunately, for this style of quantification algorithms, any kind of problem where you're trying to go through and trace out and find things in images, you actually need less data than if you were to produce something that were, say, to predict the outcome of these patients. So that's a huge bonus. Finally, from a regulatory perspective, quantification algorithms do not formally perform a diagnostic analysis. In other words, not actually telling you that this person has a brain tumor, or even go through and differentiate type of tumor. All you're doing is sort of highlighting the regions on the image that look abnormal, right? And it's up to the physician still to make a final diagnosis. And again, from a regulatory perspective, that makes things a lot easier. The second category, again, under that image processing header from earlier, is image reconstruction. So to arrive at the images that physicians and experts look at and interpret, in fact, there's a multi-step process by which underlying raw data, typically acquired in some, again, non-interpretable, non-human interpretable form, needs to be reconstructed to again, kind of get back at the data you want. And this process, as you might imagine, could be very tricky, particularly if your goal is to try to scan quickly. If your goal is to try to reconstruct data without necessarily acquiring every bit of information that you would normally get. There are traditional mathematical ways to enforce, say, for example, the expected symmetry of certain acquisition spaces to, again, give you an approximation for this. But machine learning models, and particularly deep learning models, have a very robust ability to enforce some prior knowledge of what things should look like when images are reconstructed, right? And so that's where we're seeing, again, a lot of interesting and useful applications. I would actually go so far as to point out almost every imaging manufacturer nowadays will be using something like this internally under the hood on their newer scanners. This technology is extremely popular because, again, from a development perspective, generative models for creating realistic-looking images, again, is fairly mature. The underlying data, furthermore, can be simulated because you can foreseeably acquire high-quality, fully sampled data. If you want to, I guess, if you want to replicate or simulate a version of the degraded data, all you need to do is remove information from a fully sampled data set. And finally, again, like before, image reconstruction or image enhancement tools do not perform diagnosis primarily, right? They're only going to be used to improve the quality images that radiologists ultimately then interpret, and from a regulatory perspective, is much more straightforward. Here's just another example of the same exact concept where using machine learning tools, you can enhance the specific abnormality at hand. Oftentimes you can do so by injecting the patient with less tracer or maybe acquiring the data in a less invasive way than you otherwise would need to. So again, this idea of using learned priors to enhance what you expect should be there. And then finally here, I'm going to point out a third sort of umbrella category for diagnosis. So moving beyond image processing to actually trying to find and detect abnormalities. Now, there are a huge number of things you might imagine that doctors are interested in detecting, but it turns out there's a very specific narrow type of problem that is the most popular. And these tend to be, number one, problems that are reasonably straightforward and simple to detect. So things that on a binary basis you can go through and sort of check off yes or no, this particular finding or disease is present. Again, this is much easier than more complex multi-step analyses that you might expect could be relevant in other disease cases. The second important quality is that for the most part, these are emergency diagnoses. These are things that you can make an impact or difference by quickly detecting and assisting your physician with. These are popular because, again, from a technology perspective, because most of these abnormalities are fairly straightforward, the technology that you need, the deep learning methods are, again, straightforward. It's not a very subtle finding. By virtue of being fairly emergent diagnoses and things that come through the ER frequently, a lot of these diagnoses are common, and you'll have plenty of data to build models from. And then finally, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in a dedicated section on the FDA. But from a regulatory perspective, there are straightforward mechanisms and pathways to get these algorithms into clinical practice. Now, again, I will point out, some of you may say, well, Peter, if these are obvious diagnoses, why do you need AI to help you make them? Well, again, it's more along this idea of urgency and ability to quickly sift through a large volume of cases to find the subset of patients that are truly warranting urgent attention. Again, this idea of prioritization and triage is really what drives a lot of these applications into adoption. Now, I'm going to zoom in on this real quick here and give you one very specific example that is potentially arguably one of the most popular applications of AI in medicine today, and that's going to be in the triage of patients with suspected stroke. As a very brief primer, stroke is a disease whereby your brain, for one reason or another, does not get the oxygen that it needs, right? The cells in your brains, the neurons specifically, are extremely dependent on robust blood supply. Every minute for which you do not have blood to a part of the brain, millions of neurons will die permanently. So it's a very critical organ and disease process because of that. Now, importantly, from a treatment perspective, there's actually I guess an evolution that's worth pointing out. About 15 or 20 years ago, anyone presenting with a stroke is essentially treated with blood thinners, no matter what the underlying cause is. But again, very recently, with the advent of new microcatheters to essentially thread little small tools into blood vessels into your body, it is now possible to extract and remove clot from certain parts of the brain, if that's the specific type of stroke that you have. Again, there are a lot of strokes out there, but if you have that type of stroke, we can actually do something very proactive about it. So as a background, that's the disease entity. Now, where does AI fit in? Well, it turns out there are three very important triage imaging-related questions that you need to answer to figure out if you're a patient that actually will benefit from this therapy. And again, very briefly, these are going to be, number one, making sure that there is not an active brain bleed, right? So some strokes present with a lack of oxygen to the brain and a bleed. And if that's the case, you have to treat it completely different. If you do not have a brain bleed, then the next step is to try to see if there is a clot, if there's something big enough that we can go in and remove. And if we do see that, then the final third step is to determine how much of the brain tissue has already passed away, has already died from lack of oxygen. If too much brain tissue is is irreversibly damaged, then opening up that blood vessel might actually cause more harm than helping the patient. So anyways, you need all three in a very quick succession to determine if a patient is a candidate to quickly go into a procedure. And this, of course, needs to happen with the idea that there's only a small number of centers anywhere that can perform these type of stroke embolectomies. And so for the most part, a lot of the patients are going to be receiving their triage diagnosis and imaging while in transit to a centralized entity, such as a university center like the one I work in. Here's a quick video example of two of those steps, tools that we've developed to both look for a brain bleed on the left here is what you'll see, and to look for that specific type of vessel occlusion, so clot in a blood vessel. And what you'll first appreciate is sort of the speed at which these algorithms can quickly sift through and pick out patients that are potentially abnormal. And if you sort of click into any of the patients with a suspected abnormality, you'll see that indeed, though the finding may be very subtle, with the assistance of some visual cues, you're able to kind of hone in on the areas of interest very quickly. Again, a small amount of bleed, for example, here along the top curvature of the brain, and then a very small, vessel cutoff, basically a portion where blood is no longer perfusing the brain due to a small clot. The third step was, again, sort of analyzing the amount of dead tissue, irreversibly damaged tissue in the brain. And again, here's an example of an AI-based method to do just that. And here, in fact, is a list of a number of other tools. So I just showed you a handful that we've worked on that are, in fact, FDA approved and used around the world. But again, to be clear, this is arguably one of the most popular areas of active development and commercialization based on the various number of tools that you could go out and work with. And again, this is several years old, so there's probably quite a bit more now, even in present day. So what happens if you turn on such a solution and start using it? Well, what you'll see, importantly here, is improved outcomes. And I emphasize this, it sounds kind of silly, but it turns out that most things that you try to do in a hospital don't end up producing any tangible outcomes benefit. In other words, I might make the radiologist slightly faster, or the radiologist might just feel a little bit more confident when they click sign and send out a report. But does that actually result in improved patient outcomes? Again, most of the time, the answer is probably not. And so this is in part why stroke is such a powerful example, because of the need for that rapid diagnosis. And again, the differences that occur on a minute-by-minute basis due to diagnosis delay. Again, on average, we'll see a reduction in what we call door-to-puncture time, or the amount of time it takes a patient to make it from the imaging studies into the operating room. That reduction is anywhere from 20 minutes up to over an hour in certain cases. And if you look at outcomes at 5 days at patient discharge and even up to 3 months after the stroke, you'll see a consistent trend towards better overall patient outcomes. From a hospital perspective, those that sort of work with the financial bottom line, you'll also find that there's a tangible cost savings. Anywhere from 5 to 20% of these type of strokes are missed by experts. So experts that are trying to look at this but are just burdened by large volume, or maybe reading cases at 2 a.m. in the morning when you're a little bit tired, right? So the ability to ensure you actually don't miss this finding is critical. In addition, again, with that idea of transferring patients and making sure people go where they need to go, it turns out that about 50% of the time, a patient with a suspected stroke shows up at the primary stroke center after a transfer and is no longer eligible for therapy because things have taken so long. And so again, all these missed opportunities are exactly the types of problems that we're hoping advanced technology like AI will help. All right, so with that intro, I want to shift gears a bit and talk a little bit about some of the practical things that have allowed these type of models that I just showed you to really flourish. Why is it that these tools are popular, and others, for example, don't necessarily make it. And some of you in the audience, in fact, might be working on models, might have an interesting tool, and you're just curious, like, what does it take now to actually get that into the hands of a physician? Well, there's a couple steps. So the first thing that you'll want to do is to make sure your model actually works beyond the sort of clean cohorts or the very precise environment for which your model was trained, right? So this is, again, known as generalizability in the AI world. And again, generalizability is actually really hard. So the reasons are similar to what I've alluded to before. One is, again, the lack of quality data to train models. These are some of the numbers that we typically work with. Again, looking at hundreds to maybe thousands or rarely tens of thousands of patients. But those numbers really pale in comparison to the tens of millions or even billions of images that Facebook, for example, can train on. So we have quite a bit of work cut out for us. And again, as I mentioned, the imaging appearance is extremely heterogeneous. From hospital to hospital, you will have differences in underlying hardware, the protocols, the way things are scanned, such that we almost universally expect there to be a drop in performance when we take a model and move it somewhere else. So really, the question is just trying to quantify how much is that drop, and is that drop something that we can tolerate? If you have a model that seems to work pretty well and you have a diverse data set to achieve reasonable generalizability, then you've got to figure out practically how to actually put the results in front of your physicians. Here, there's probably three major categories, three ways to do it. And I have them graphically shown here. Sort of on the left-hand side of the image here is through existing and known hardware manufacturers, right? So in radiology, in medicine, across the board, hardware manufacturers tend to predominate the market, and they tend to essentially, they're able to push tools and push new technology through their interfaces easier and faster than anyone else. In other words, if you buy a scanner and the AI tools that you want are already pre-built into the console, then there's a good chance that tool will easily find a niche, an avenue forward to implementation and deployment. And this is especially true for algorithms that work with, again, that image processing, image enhancement type of outcome. On the far right-hand side of the image are the actual viewing softwares that are used to display data and that radiologists use to make an interpretation, to measure and to reorient and to sort of, again, analyze the underlying data. Again, this is a natural entry point because physicians tend not to want to click one other button or open up another window to get the results they want. They will typically tolerate slightly less performant tools as long as it's easily accessible. And so that's the other major category. And then here in the middle, as you can see, are one of hundreds now of startup companies which basically try to sit in the middle in some way to intercept data as it's coming from the scanner and spit out results to the end user who's sort of sitting there interpreting the study. There's probably two major categories of startups in the space. The vast majority are those that produce one or a few specific algorithms that do, again, a very specific narrow task, whether it's looking for stroke or looking for cancer. And then there are a handful of companies out there who have decided to develop or host platforms, basically app stores, if you will, such that rather than integrating each small startup's tools one by one, you sort of go through the integration process just once through a uniform interface, and then have the ability to flexibly try a number of different specific vendor solutions in a, again, more efficient way. All right, so FDA clearance. I think this is definitely a topic that is probably not understood very well and is opaque, especially to non-experts. So my goal here for the next 5 or 10 minutes is just to disambiguate what the FDA does and what it does not do, and basically some practical takeaways if you're ever working in the medtech space and need to work through some of these regulatory pathways. So first of all, I mean, I guess I was told I shouldn't engage or I shouldn't ask questions because it's kind of hard to hear what folks are saying, but maybe show of hands, who thinks that you're going to need FDA clearance before any of these tools ever hit a hospital anywhere? It has to be FDA cleared, right, before patients are working with it some way. Yeah, so that's a common misconception, which we'll talk about shortly. What about the role of the FDA? So how many of you guys basically assume that if a tool is FDA cleared, that's basically something that should benefit the patient? That's something that should be useful and good, right? Is that the role of the FDA, to tell you how good or how bad any specific product is? Yeah, not really, right? I didn't see a lot of hands, and I asked it in a very leading way, so that probably didn't help. But yeah, so a couple things to keep in mind. You only need FDA clearance when you're trying to market or commercially distribute a product, right? So if you're trying to sell your tool to somebody, and you claim in the process that this tool does XYZ thing, then the FDA will come through and make sure that it does exactly that thing that you described that it does, right? So that sort of kind of makes sense. But it turns out that a lot of the AI that we use today, especially things that I grow in my own lab, for example, at the university, I'm not trying to commercialize that. I'm just trying to improve the overall workflow and clinical experience of my patients. And if that's true, I don't actually need FDA. Now, there's a caveat there. The caveat is that what I really need is my local hospital IRB to come through and tell me that what I'm doing makes sense and it's not significant risk to the patient, right? So my local hospital gets to make that determination. I see a hand coming up here in a second, so give me 1 second to finish this thought, and I actually will address it. But so most of the time you don't. Now, sometimes your local hospital doesn't feel comfortable making that determination, and if that's true, then yes, so an agency like the FDA would need to step in and sort of confirm that that's something that's reasonable. And we'll talk about different categories of devices in a second. But long and short of it is that software, for the most part, does not require that escalation. There was a comment here in the front. So yeah, go ahead. I'll take it now. The IRB is a local entity. So for example, an entity within my hospital, which would review my research protocol and make a determination of whether or not that sounds like it would be safe for the patient, right? So it's just a local team that does QA and understands a little bit about research to determine whether or not something makes sense moving forward. Yeah, so it's a local determination though. Yes. So the question here was about HIPAA. And so for those that aren't aware, HIPAA are a set of laws that govern patient identifiable information and trying to essentially make sure that anything that might be potentially sensitive is not disclosed. So that essentially ties into your local IRB. Most local IRBs will require some degree of HIPAA compliance before approving and agreeing to do something. But I should say, if we're going to use an AI tool in practice clinically, right, that AI tool by definition will have access to HIPAA information, right, to actually make a diagnosis and point out which patients need care, for example. So it's not a formal requirement, but yeah, HIPAA, of course, does potentially play in certain protocols. Good questions. Good questions. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, good. So the question is, well, if you're telling me, Peter, that you don't actually need FDA locally, how does your hospital determine that you're being safe? And so the long story short is that essentially all algorithms that we make to date, and even out of all algorithms that are available commercially in the US, all such algorithms require direct supervision by an expert. There's no autonomous AI in use today that could essentially make a decision without a human in the loop, right? And so that's what. So all of our tools are designed to assist or augment what humans do. But because an expert radiologist has to review everything anyways, for the most part, it's considered a safe thing to do. Yes, that's right. So that's a great transition. So the comment was basically there are some other more invasive devices like implants, right? Absolutely, and certain novel pharmaceutical agents. All of those would be certainly in a different category, which is a good transition to this slide. So there are three major tiers of devices that the FDA will bucket your particular application in from 1 through 3. And essentially, without getting into too many details, this is just arranged in increasing risk. So a class 1 device is the least, has a least amount of risk, and a class 3 device is exactly what we're talking about, the more invasive medical devices, implants, and things like that. And again, long story short is that a class 1 or a class 2 device for which software as a medical device, SAMD, almost universally is a class 2 device, that will be regulated using sort of the principles I just mentioned a second ago. There is a link here from the FDA if you're ever curious and you want to know specifically, is my device a class 2 or a class 3 tool, then you can always look them up. It's pretty simple. And from a clearance perspective, this is also reasonably important because a class 1 or class 2 device, for the most part, can be approved by the FDA through what's known as the 510K clearance pathway. In other words, all I need to do is to prove that what I'm proposing is similar to something that came before. If you are the first one to ever do something, so if I was the first person to ever build an AI application, then I would still actually have to do quite a bit of work to make sure that the FDA understands, the risks. But assuming that one other person has done this, then typically all I need to do is prove non-inferiority to an existing commercial device. Again, that's in contrast to a class 3 device where you always need pre-market approval. You always need sort of this prolonged process, no matter what. Again, a little bit more detail about 510Ks if you're ever interested. Again, I'm not going to cover a ton of detail here, but I will point out that you can simply just go online and look up any 510K submission if you're ever curious, basically what went into this thing that I'm using, right? It's not a secret. It has to be made public. You can go online to this database and, again, really search any commercial tool that you like. I have a startup. We have 7 or 8 FDA clearances at this point. And so I'm going to look up myself just for demonstration purposes here. You can see that in the documentation, I will be required to disclose publicly all the data that I use to make the model and to test its performance. What's kind of interesting you'll see here is that in this particular application, this is going to be a tool for detecting clots in the lung, so pulmonary emboli, clots in the lung. I really only needed about 200 cases or patients with a clot and about 200 that don't have a clot, right? So in this validation test scenario, the benchmarks aren't quite as rigorous as you might expect. Again, where in AI world, you typically see cohorts in the millions or tens of millions of cases. It's a modest lift with, a distribution of data across various hardware manufacturers. And the performance here, again, simply needs to be similar to the performance of tools that exist in the space, right? This is interesting because it doesn't actually tell you anything about how this tool will be used in practice and what will happen if you turn it on, whether or not this tool will improve patient outcomes or improve any workflow at all. This tool simply has performance characteristics that are similar. In other words, a sensitivity and a specificity around 90%. Another way to think about that is if 100 patients came in through the door, 90% of the patients with stroke would be found by your algorithm. You would miss about 10% of the strokes that came through. And a specificity means that out of everyone who doesn't have stroke, again, about 90% of those patients that do not have stroke would be correctly predicted as not having that stroke. But then about 10% of them would be flagged incorrectly as a false positive. And I realized I interchanged stroke and clots at the lung here, so I apologize if that was confusing, but you sort of get what I'm trying to say here. All right. Again, some just practical stuff for those that want it. Certainly these slides I can make available, and you'll have a recording afterwards. But again, big picture, it takes at minimum about 90 days from time of initial submission to getting a decision letter for something like an FDA 510K determination. And interestingly, the submission fee itself is modest. It's only about $5,000 to $20,000, depending on the size of your company. Now, of course, the fine print is that you would ideally want to pre-submit some of this information to the FDA a month or two before you put in your formal paperwork. At that point, the FDA can come back to you and flag certain things that it wants improved or updated, and that way you can address this ahead of time before you formally submit your application for review. In addition, if you've never done this before, and in fact, even if you have, it's a good idea to consult experts or specific legal entities who specialize in FDA submissions. So that'll set you back another $25,000 to $40,000 at least, depending on what you're trying to look to do. And what this means is that on average, you're looking at about half a year, give or take, from the initial time of submission to when you get your determination for 510 clearance. But I will point out again, this is actually perhaps more straightforward than you might imagine. Again, this is why there are hundreds of FDA-approved tools using AI in imaging today. All right, one final note on the FDA. So the FDA essentially, when you submit to the FDA, when you submit a specific 510K clearance, you're going to need to specify the category or style or type of application for the software that you want. And my point in bringing this up is that, in a way, this ends up dictating the styles of applications that are ultimately popular, right? In other words, if I have multiple pathways and some of the pathways are very rigorous, I'm unlikely to submit to that because the burden of evidence is very high. Whereas other pathways that may have been designed in a way to really facilitate new technology adoption, and especially here in AI, those tend to predominate, even if they're not always the best fit for the technology you want to propose. So again, in our world, what that means is that almost 90% of our diagnostic tools, so the things that try to make a prediction of diagnosis, those typically get submitted as triage applications. That's, again, that big category of things where on a binary yes or no basis, you determine whether or not something is present in a volume. And again, the upside of this is that, again, the clearance threshold is a little bit easier. I don't need as much data as you just saw, and I just need to be non-inferior to an existing company. On the flip side, I have to adhere to all the rules that a triage tool necessitate. And that, for example, means that I can't actually point out where an image abnormality is. I can only just flag the entire case as being normal, abnormal. And again, that might have some unanticipated consequences, right? If the algorithm flags something as being positive, but I don't see anything wrong, and I'm thinking it's otherwise probably just a negative normal exam, I might now spend extra time looking at it because, I don't want to be someone that missed the finding that the AI made. So anyways, there's a lot of, interesting interplay there. And again, it has a lot of just to do with practical things, not necessarily what clinicians themselves necessarily want. All right, so finally here, from a business perspective, I want to highlight and emphasize this idea of making sure the algorithms that you're interested in and the algorithms you produce truly make a clinical impact or at least some financial impact on the bottom line. Again, making me as a radiologist faster, right? Or making my clinicians overall faster or more confident, or even decreasing errors. Those are things that are overall pretty good, but don't always necessarily translate to an outcome, right? There's so many factors that are involved in the care of any given patient for any one disease process, such that like one small variable here that we're trying to interact with doesn't always have a robust impact. Because of this, some of the best tools that we see, again, almost counterintuitively, are simply those that find a way to treat more patients than we otherwise wouldn't have, right? So again, in the case of stroke, it might be getting a patient to a specialized center faster so we can treat more stroke patients. But that could also be something as simple as going through an image study and measuring the density of your bones, right? Because you might find that a significant portion of your population has osteoporosis and can benefit from specific medical therapies or potentially even surgical ones if it's severe enough. Again, that sounds like a super simple tool. Like measuring the density of your bones seems not super interesting or critical, but because that has a tangible ROI, things like that become very popular and dominant in the field. And finally, of course, while we're on the topic of finances, reimbursement codes would be extremely useful. Part of the reason stroke has been so popular, in addition to everything else I've discussed, is that it was really the first tool that received a special CMS reimbursement code for early adoption. The particular pathway is known as the NTAP, or the New Technology Add-on Payment, which is essentially a 2 or 3 year probationary CMS code that will give you a pilot run of reimbursement, again, just to encourage adoption and to figure out whether or not a tool has potential for improved outcomes. In this particular case, you could be paid up to about $1,000 on top of what would otherwise be billed in a patient admission, which essentially boils down to extra payment for cases of true positive stroke. So it's not like everyone that comes through and is analyzed gets the bonus reimbursement. It's really mathematically, it only ends up triggering for positive stroke patients. But again, it was critical because with that additional upfront payment, we were able to gather evidence and really show that this was a useful tool. And again, now that we're past the official NTAP reimbursement period for several years now, stroke still remains and is useful and is something that hospitals continue to purchase and use. All right, like I said, I was going to try to keep this to less than an hour, so I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to end just with a few quick slides about my specific lab and team and center at the university. Again, as you heard in the intro briefly, we're essentially a new multidisciplinary group that tries to sit at the intersection of healthcare and technology and computer science and really translate a lot of these ideas into the clinic. We're extremely collaborative, which means that we work both with internal academic folks as well as many external partners. So if that's you out there and you have some interesting data or ideas, certainly feel free to reach out to me. We have a lot of data compute, this is actually quite outdated now, so quite a bit more compute than this, and tools to translate on projects. And most importantly, we have the means to take an idea and turn it on in the clinic and just get some feedback to see what will work and oftentimes what does not work. So that's an overview there. I'm going to leave my contact information up. Again, we finished with quite a bit of time, so I do want to open up for discussion, which I think will be a lot more interesting. But feel free to jot down my contact info here. Happy to chat afterwards if we don't get a chance to get to your questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. Very interesting.
I think thanks. This was super informative. I think in one of the slides you mentioned that you lack data samples essentially, right? I was wondering if you can use like synthetic data or something like that to potentially generate more data and what implications it has in this domain.
Yeah, great question. So again, for those that may not have heard it, the question is about data. I mentioned that data is a big challenge in developing models, and that's absolutely correct. It's a challenge for a number of reasons. So it's to be clear, in aggregate, there is enough data in this world to build models without question. But the challenges relate to more practical things about how do we centralize and get the data all in one place. And even after we do that, how do we properly curate and clean the data, right? By and large, that requires experts, requires physicians sitting down and spending hours of their time sifting through data. It's a very expensive and very tedious process. So the reality is that we typically train with, again, cohorts on the order of hundreds to thousands. Now your follow-up was, well, why don't we use synthetic data? That's very popular, in fact, in a lot of other domains. So there are a couple practical limitations there. So one is that when you build a generative model on imaging data, what you're essentially doing is you're reformulating or basically creating a snapshot of information that you used to train that data. So by definition, it's pretty hard to generate fundamentally new knowledge, fundamentally new information from data that you're building a generative model from. The one use case where it can be useful is that if you're having problems sharing data because people are worried about privacy and people are worried about HIPAA, which was brought up, right? And you just wanted a very mobile way to deliver your data to other people, and again, a seamless and safe way as possible, then it might make sense to train a generative model on some isolated secure data set and then simply distribute the generative model else. And so that has, again, it's been explored. I can't say it's broadly accepted, but that would make sort of a little bit more technical sense than simply trying to, like, say, train a generative model on my 100 stroke patients and then using that to build another model. They end up essentially mirroring the same underlying information.
Dr. Chang, you mentioned urgency and prioritization regarding a diagnosis from the imaging data. My question is similar to the gentleman before me. It's a two-part question. As an entrepreneur and as a medical professional, would you prefer all this data to be siloed into a privately controlled, centralized data center, or would you want this data to be open source?
Good question. Okay, so another data management question about potentially would it be easier if we could just somehow open source the data a bit and centralize archives? So yeah, there's a couple directions to tackle this. So the first thing I'll point out is that one of the biggest bottlenecks to centralizing data typically is the problem with HIPAA and not revealing anything too sensitive about the patient. A brain MRI, for example, or a head CT, that includes your face, right? Although it's kind of hard to see because hair doesn't come through on images very well, you can essentially reconstruct a hairless version of a face and potentially use that for facial recognition, right? Hypothetically or theoretically. Now, interestingly, if you ask the everyday patient whether or not they care, or would they be open to sharing their data for furthering science, by and large, patients actually don't care about that, right? In fact, I was talking to a couple of you, so some of you guys that have gotten a CAT scan or an MRI, right? Sometimes the first thing you might do if you get your hands on it is just post it on Facebook or post it on social media. The true patient security and HIPAA concerns are probably, again, more theoretical than real. So then, yeah, so the question is, would it make sense and would it be beneficial in some way to centralize it? Absolutely. There are efforts to do that. So national radiology societies, for example, many that I work with, are putting together, modest, medium-sized data sets. The NIH, for example, which is our government funding agency, any large-scale study that the NIH funds now has to be, there's a rider where you have to send your data in after the trial is over so that they can, use it for downstream research. So there are ongoing efforts. But I will say, maybe my final note is that compared to other countries, we're still fairly behind the ball. Nationalized healthcare systems, such as the one you would find in the UK, for example, do a much better job. Large centralized data sets for learning. And then, places like in China or Asia, where the regulation and concern for patient, safety is a little bit less. I mean, they have no problems aggregating very, very large data sets very quickly. So, anyways, long answer, but I think it's a great question.
On your presentation, you didn't mention anything about standards, and with medical applications, I'm very used to seeing like that, and anything on engineering related. I was wondering if you had any insight on standards for AI and medicine, or if you're involved on any standardization processes and stuff like that.
Yeah, great question. So the question was around standards and why it seems like there's an apparent lack of standards in the space. So yeah, number one, that's probably generally speaking true. One is because in general, I would say standards within medical imaging and medical informatics are really slow, and they don't, the DICOM standard that we use for medical imaging, for example, that was developed back in a time where we only had 2D imaging data. It was coming at you one slice at a time. And by and large, every imaging study you would ever obtain would contain at most a handful of images. We use the exact same protocols today to send thousands of images across 3D volumes in a way that's extremely inefficient and really doesn't make any sense and breaks a lot of our software all the time. But that's what we have. What that's to say is that the standards are absolutely essential, but probably not well developed at all in our space right now. Within DICOM, there's some minimal standards for how to ingest AI output. But that's probably about it. The vendors themselves can pretty much still do anything they want in terms of how they process data, the types of outputs they can generate. Even simple things like adjusting model thresholds or things like that, right? There's no standardization at all in the space. So it's a big limitation, no question.
I just want to add to the question about standards. If you are looking at the security side of things, there's an organization called the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP for short, and they have started publishing top 10 for LLM, and they've also started publishing for agentic AI as well. So some security controls, how to evaluate, and what to do to protect. So just wanted to add to that.
I just had a quick question about, you mentioned specificity and sensitivity computations, false positive rates, true positive rates, negative rates. Now, obviously, the AI algorithms can make mistakes, as well as radiologists can also make mistakes. So absent ground truth, how exactly are you computing these?
Great question. So for the group, the question is, how do you know how good your models are ultimately, right? What are you using to truth your algorithms? So you're correct. I would say for most of our applications, we rely on human experts, which is very limited. If we're a little bit better in our study design, we might use several radiologists in consensus one another. But even that has a lot of limitations. Occasionally, we'll also look at future studies, which is nice. If we're unsure what's happening today, we can typically wait a few weeks or a few months later, and the truth will reveal itself in a more obvious manner later. And finally, you can also look at pathologic ground truth, right? So invasively sampling tissue or doing some surgical operation to get a better idea of what's going on. But suffice it to say, none of those methods are bulletproof, right? You're obviously going to be limited in a lot of those scenarios. So it's very hard. It's very hard. I would say, one way to think about things is that we know that every label has a degree of noise to it. And so probably the first thing that you need to do for any project is to estimate and understand the noise in your labeling. So we typically have multiple experts go head to head, and we see what the agreement between experts are. And whatever that agreement is, we consider to be the upper limits of theoretical accuracy, right? And we use that sort of as a benchmark.
I was wondering about the kind of interaction between FDA clearance and improvements to the models. When I worked on the old medical expert systems back in the dark ages, there was always this tension between we wanted to keep improving the systems, but we didn't want to improve it so much or introduce new behaviors that would potentially invalidate our 510K.
Yep.
So do you still experience that tension, and how do you navigate that in terms of like retraining or fine-tuning the models or any of these things?
It's a great question. So the question was about fine-tuning models and what's the degree of dynamic updates a model can afford, especially in the context of FDA and what's allowed from a regulatory perspective. So the short answer is that you're not allowed to change anything. If you change something, even today in 2025, with the latest and greatest deep learning models, that requires a complete new update to your submission, right? I would say, practically speaking, the FDA is looking at changing this stance. There's a white paper that was released a few years ago where they acknowledged that this paradigm significantly hampers what we can do with AI models. I discussed, for example, that generalizability is a huge problem. So what happens when you turn it on and you realize, hey, it doesn't work for me? There are a lot of good ways to make that model better nowadays. A lot of unsupervised learning techniques, for example, where my model can continuously update some foundation of knowledge without even needing labels. And that should ideally help the models train better. So again, not something we can do today, but the FDA has floated out the idea that if you can somehow continuously benchmark your performance against a known centralized cohort and make sure whatever updates you do can be automatically benchmarked against those and make sure those are okay. That's one of the key parts of it. In addition, the FDA is moving potentially towards a process where they approve really the entire workflow, if you will, of a company, as opposed to the application itself. So if you do things in this way and you test it in this manner and you're building an algorithm to do X, Y, Z, then we're going to approve, again, almost you as a company and as a process, as opposed to the individual application. So those are the trends I think that, again, will hopefully become the standard. But yeah, today in 2025, you're still pretty much locked. With again, the final caveat that I pointed out, which is that if you're doing things yourself, there's a lot of flexibility. So a lot of folks will also work closely with companies, and now instead of a commercial relationship, it's a research collaboration, and we're working to make your tool better. And if you have those types of relationships in place, then yeah, you will see a lot of, again, changes and sort of updates under the hood, under that auspice.
Yeah, actually, just something similar to what his point is. My question: in your experience, you're developing a software as a medical device, right? From a 510K perspective, is it easy to find predicate device? Because many of these are new, right? There is nothing like there is one out there you compare and you say it's as good as or. But yeah. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question relates to how easy it is to find predicate devices, right? So I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing, but it's shockingly easy to find a predicate device. And part of the reason is because we're not very creative in what we do. Even though there's, 500 FDA-approved tools in our space, I would say there's probably only 10 or 15 major application categories. They're all the same with very minor modifications. And sort of the way you interpret broadly a disease entity, right? You can essentially get away with a lot. So again, stroke, for example, includes all those different things that I just described, a lot of little sub-diagnostic steps, for example. And again, a lot of things that are potentially very interesting don't meet the criteria for usefulness that I've described elsewhere. So rare cancers, right? Rare cancers are extremely rare, and there's a ton of them, but there's not a commercial market for them. So no one's trying to do an 510K for a rare disease. So anyways, so again, outside of the triage applications are the most quote unquote diagnostic ones. They'll try to pin a label and a diagnosis to an exam, but the rest of the things that you saw, yeah, that's correct. So a lot of the image processing, image enhancement type of algorithms, those are very generic as well. And again, we've had non-deep learning ways to do that for a long time too. So quite frankly, yeah, the predicates there are also reasonably straightforward. Yeah.
Just sort of picking back on the startup world, I guess. So I just want to see if you have any insights on sort of the go-to-market strategy in terms of the software as a product, and whether or not that changes anything relative to other fields as well. So any hurdles that you've seen when trying to introduce partnerships, perhaps, and any regulatory hurdles?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is just about sort of startups in the healthcare space and what makes it different? What are some unique obstacles you face? So a couple things. One is that the barrier to entry is actually quite high overall, which means that for any given product or thing you want to develop, there's actually not going to be a ton of different players in the space. And that's a good and bad thing. It typically means that, it doesn't seem you have a lot of competition at the outset, especially if you can get that F10K or FDA approval, you'll be one of a few. The flip side of that is that the legacy handful of large companies that are in the space, they dominate the market. And it's very, very hard to get a foothold. Very hard to get your initial, 10, 15, 20 hospitals. And so because of that, for me personally, so I have a startup. We are a business-to-business entity that specializes in making the models and getting FDA clearance or CE mark in Europe or the equivalent regulatory clearance. And then we simply partner with a larger company to get the tools out there in the world. Again, there's the GEs, the Siemens, the Philips, Canons, that make up almost all of the healthcare space in our world in imaging, and there will be equivalent entities in whatever med tech space you're in. So yeah, it's hard to compete, and so it's easier to partner and work through one of those avenues for sure. Yeah, good question. So what's the formal commercialization model? So I would say it depends on the partner. A a lot of times it'll be some sort of licensing deal, which then on the front end for the actual customer will be sort of a per year. We'll sort of scope out the number of exams and patients you have, and it'll be a per year charge. But yeah, sometimes folks don't want to share and they want to create some exclusive tool that only one company has. That's also very popular. So it just really kind of depends on your specific niche, what the competition kind of looks like. But yeah, big picture, I would say, trying to find some larger partner early on would be, pretty wise for a lot of these, applications.
So I have a quick question about data collection and privacy. So I'm just wondering, do you collect your own data for the image processing? If you do collect it, so I'm wondering what is that process look like? Because I know that the electronic medical record is pretty hard to come by because the privacy matter and things like that.
Yeah. So where does our data come from, right? That's a pretty popular, pretty good question. I'll start by telling a little story. So I'm about 6 or 7 years ago, I finished up sort of the later stages of my training. I was already working in the entrepreneurial space, and I, was in the Bay Area at the time, right? So I had actually made a reasonable kind of final decision to not practice medicine anymore, because there just seemed like there was so much opportunity elsewhere, right? And at the last second, I had an opportunity here at UCI to build a new lab and a center and to basically still do what I wanted to do and focus on this type of work, but do so within an academic setting. And one of the key advantages I've seen now, again, having been at the university now for 5 or 6 years, is that we have access to data. That's an extremely valuable asset that I 100% agree with. Most commercial entities out there really struggle to find. So in our particular lab and center, we have 4 million imaging exams from our entire digitized archive that we work with. We have access to, again, all the information we need and also a sandbox to test out our tools to get clinical feedback right away. Practically speaking, if you're a company out there that needs data, I would say that there are commercial brokers now. So there are probably 3 or 4 big companies that will come in and contract with hospitals to basically sell data, right? It's not cheap. So you're looking at typically anywhere from $20 to over $100 for just one exam. And that doesn't include annotation and curation, right? So typically you also have to hire or work with consulting physicians. So the data cleaning and processing part can be very tedious, but it is an option now.
Right. So within the US, there is a long line of like having historical data recorded, but there's also like a lot of countries that do not have consistent medical records, or rather like a lot of it is not digitized even. And same goes for like there's been multiple cultures where like lack of history has resulted in like different inferences for the patient. So, but with like models, LLM models that are helping doctors like achieve their prognosis, like if there isn't data for a specific country or like a specific ethnicity or like group of people, that could result in them being overlooked. So I'd like to think all of this is contingent based on obtaining data. So what does that process look like at a global scale? And what would be the implications of it? Because in case we're unable to obtain data, they're no longer recognized. We might not be able to identify diseases, or we might not be able to identify what they're undergoing.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, broadly speaking, we're just looking at, concepts of fairness and bias within modeling and the inherent challenges of enforcing that in the medical setting where, again, as you absolutely correctly pointed out, so underprivileged, underserved communities simply don't access the healthcare system like others do. And, no matter what you do, you can't compensate for that, right? And for example, by the time a lower income individual seeks medical care, their disease is much more advanced and the outcomes are a lot worse, right? If I built a model, for example, we looked at COVID outcomes prediction a lot, right? A lot of hospitals did. So we had models to predict, is this patient going to decompensate? Is this patient going to end up in the ICU? Well, it would tend to like over-predict certain demographics, right? Because that's just practically what happened. So, I mean, it's very, very challenging. I don't think anyone's really definitively proved that it can be solved. I think you brought up the idea of working with global networks, which in part helps the problem. I would say probably more important than everything else, you just want to think practically how you're using the tool at the end of the day. How does the bias translate? Some biases, again, might actually make sense, right? Again, if you're looking at COVID outcomes, yeah, maybe certain demographics are influenced more. And as a result, I need to allocate more resources. So that bias is being translated in a way that will make a clinical and meaningful benefit. But obviously, there's a lot of negative biases that can perpetuate too. So you just have to really think critically how things are used at the other end and make sure you don't amplify that bias at the end. But it's a challenge. I agree. I wish I had a better answer than that, but it's very challenging.
So I might have missed this, but I was hoping that you could give an overview of preventative AI use for preventative like outcomes in medicine, because a lot of what I saw here were, or like you already have the disease and thereafter it improves the workflow. So yeah, if you can just talk to it or speak to the maturity of that industry, that would be
Sure.
great.
So yeah, the question broadly speaking was healthcare, right? True healthcare. When we talk about healthcare, we're really not talking about the care of healthy individuals. We're talking about the care of diseased individuals in the hospital. Again, like you saw in these slides. Treating healthy individuals, population health or preventative health, is absolutely critical to control costs, to improve outcomes. We don't do a lot in it, to be very honest. I would say the biggest area of work you'll see are digital wearable devices and things that are direct to consumer, where consumers are coming out and proactively seeking these type of tools. I have a continuous glucose monitor on my arm right now. I do not have diabetes. I run Ironman triathlons, and I'm actually using this for performance enhancement and to sort of hack your health. But this type of stuff is extremely popular. Using AI to better understand how to make sense of the data, for example, that's extremely valuable. The Apple Watch with the EKG devices inside of them, right? They're continuously recording your heart rate and your heart waveforms in a way that no one can really analyze unless you sat through with an AI to filter things out. So that's where we're seeing a lot of interesting research, I would say. Again, I'm using this device and I'm seeing that practically the tools out there aren't very good, so we're not there yet. But there is a lot of interest in that type of work. So I guess stay posted. The personals, the wearables, right? They're really out there and collecting a lot of cool and useful data.
I'm actually going to ask a question. I don't normally do this. So I wanted to ask you how startups in your space view intellectual property protection. Because the 510K process seems to argue against novelty from a patent perspective. So is it trade secrets, patents? How do you deal, and how important is intellectual property protection to you as creating a business?
Yeah, great question about intellectual property. How does it work in AI? So again, long and short of it, we could talk for hours about this, but by and large, you cannot patent your software code for this type of work. In fact, there's a lot of reasons for this. Practically, almost everybody will release their technique and code in the wild, right? It's a very open source community out there. So even the smartest researchers at Google, the OpenAI team makes their large language models available online. I can go online and download and run them myself locally. So again, by and large, the patents don't work well in our space. The final trained model that you're using to make predictions, the big matrices of actual model weights, that can be copyrighted. And that's when you go to commercialize a tool and you license something, it's going to be that very specific configuration of model weights. As some of you in the industry know, that's limited because if I change one out of my 10 million parameter model weights by a small amount, that's no longer covered by my copyright. So then practically, what does this all mean? Well, practically, even though this information is not protected by strong IP, there's a very inherent practical limitation to what you can do with these models on your own. In other words, I can give you the code to train a novel stroke algorithm, but if you don't have all the patient data curated, ready to go, you're not going to be able to replicate my tool. I'm sorry?
basically.
Barrier to entry, absolutely. And guess what? We host public Kaggle competitions every year where we aggregate data, the best in class annotators. We release it in the wild, and the winners are forced to release their really high performing algorithms out into the wild. It's all just sitting on the internet, right? But that's not enough to turn your code into a company, into a commercial product, right? Because of all the other things that need to happen, the barrier to entry, FDA, and all these other things. So yeah, anyways, practically speaking, there are other barriers that end up protecting your invention beyond the traditional forms of IP protection, which again are kind of limited in the space.